in partnership with the Emergency Management and Climate Readiness Ministry. For those of you that haven't attended one of these before, we are recording it. We are working on making those recordings available as soon as possible. They are not yet, but will be hopefully soon. I would just like to acknowledge that the lands that we today call British Columbia are made up of the ancestral, traditional, and unceded homelands of many, many Indigenous peoples. And the BC Association of Emergency Managers acknowledges that and is grateful for their stewardship of the lands for time immemorial, and we're grateful to be working, playing, living, and collaborating on these lands together. The BC Association of Emergency Managers, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit association for like-minded emergency managers struggling through the changes that we're all experiencing. Our membership consists of a variety of sectors, everything from private, nonprofit, post-secondary, government, right across BC. If you're interested in becoming a member, please visit our website. We do things like collaborate. We provide a voice for different groups. We're an advocacy group, and we work on various projects that come along and challenge the emergency management world. So this is the second dedicated session to the topic of the modernization of legislation. I'm going to turn it over now to our friends from Emergency Management and Climate Readiness to introduce themselves. And I'll just let you know that we are taking questions throughout the presentation on a tool called Slido. So it has been posted in the chat there. If you click on that link, you can post your questions anonymously, or you can post them with your name, however you'd like, and they just get put up on a board. And what we ask you to do is put your questions there, have a look at the questions that are going on that board and vote. So if you think you agree with that question or you really want that question answered, vote on it because it bumps it up to the top of the list. And so this is the way we're going to manage when we have 145 people on here and there's not a lot of time for questions. There's a lot of details that EMCR wants to go through. So please use the Slido link, post your question. If it doesn't get answered today, those questions get taken away and we get those answers for you later. Okay, with that, I am going to turn it over to Tina and Kai to do their introductions, and I believe Anna as well, to talk about what they're coming in to present today on the planning and risk assessment process. Thanks.
Who's taking the lead for us? Anna, is that you?
Kai. Oh, Kai, you're on mute.
Sorry, that's me. All right. And sorry, do we have access to the slides? Are they uploaded already?
I've made you a host, so whoever
okay.
has the slides should be putting them up.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry, just give me one moment here.
And if I could ask everybody else to please turn off your video so that we can conserve bandwidth, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you all.
Okay, so is everyone able to see the slides?
Yes, we are.
Fantastic. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for an overview of risk assessment and emergency management planning under the proposed modernized emergency management legislation. So today is the third presentation in a series of 5 webinars that we're happy to be offering with the BC Association of Emergency Managers. So my name is Kai Tai, and I'm a senior policy analyst on the policy and legislation team within the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So please feel free to acknowledge which territories you are joining us from today in the chat if you feel like you want to. And so today I'll be co-presenting with Anna Vunder, who is a manager of policy and legislation, and Tina Neal, who is the executive director of the disaster mitigation and adaptation at the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. All right, so in today's sessions, we're just going to go a little bit deeper into the proposed legislation, which explores the new concepts such as how the Sendai framework has informed the development of new requirements for risk assessments and emergency management planning. So that includes looking at more detail on risk assessments, which includes what the proposed legal requirements are and how the disaster and climate risk resilience assessment is implementing those new concepts and setting us and our partners up for success. And we're also going to talk about what's changing in EM planning requirements and what work is underway currently to support implementation of those requirements. We're going to briefly cover directed mitigation and preparation orders, which are the new tools for the minister. And finally, we'll touch on how the regulations relate to EM planning and risk assessment and what's planned for regulatory requirements for government ministries in that area. So you can feel free to ask us questions in the chat as we were all instructed, or at the end of the presentation, or you can also reach out to us by email if you'd like more information from the UCR. So as you may be aware from the previous sessions, we've recently published a technical paper which contains more detail on the design of the proposed legislation, and we've added the relevant page references throughout the presentation wherever we could. The technical paper is posted online at our website, so it's available, and we'll make sure we provide the link at the end of the presentation as well in case you need that for your. Okay, so before we get into the content, we just wanted to reflect that the purpose of these webinars is to share information. And we want to do this in an atmosphere where we recognize that we're all people and that we follow these commitments. So, and also upfront, we want to just let you know that this session will be recorded and shared at some point of time. So without further ado, the Sendai framework. So one of the key drivers of change in the proposed emergency management legislation is the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which was adopted by British Columbia in 2018. And the goal of the framework is substantial reduction of disaster risk using an all-of-society approach involving new partners and decision makers who are all cooperating throughout all 4 phases of emergency management. So the 4 priority areas that guide efforts towards that approach are understanding disaster risk, strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk, investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So these priorities, and in particular, priority number 1, which is understanding disaster risk, they have been a key pillar in shaping the new requirements proposed in emergency management legislation. So on to priority 1 of the Sendai framework. It basically stipulates that the policies and practices that steers risk management should be based on an understanding of disaster risk. And that includes vulnerability, capacity, hazard characteristics, exposure of persons and assets, as well as the environment. Now, the resulting knowledge of risks can then be better leveraged when we're developing pre-disaster risk assessments, planning for prevention and mitigation, developing emergency management plans, and responding and recovering from disasters. So basically a thorough risk assessment is kind of the foundation for all 4 phases of emergency management. So what is a risk assessment? Risk assessment is a tool that helps to better inform planning and preparation efforts by identifying the hazardous event and consider both the likelihood of occurrence as well as potential possible impacts that it may. It's also the fundamental first step to understand hazard risk, which is crucial to that formation of plans.
Sorry, the audio is
Hi.
crappy.
Yeah, I think the audio is cutting out on you. Can you make some adjustments?
Sure. Okay, are you able to hear me all right now?
It is still cutting in and out a bit, but it's
Hmm.
better.
Okay. Okay, are you able to hear me now? Is that okay?
Yes, yes, that's much better.
Okay. All right. All right. So for risk assessment requirements, in the new legislation, we're proposing that lead ministers, local authorities, critical infrastructure owners, and public sector agencies, which we will refer to in the legislation as regulated entities. You're going to hear that term a lot. But regulated entities are going to be required to conduct risk assessments. And this will look slightly different for each entity. So for example, lead ministers will be required to prepare and maintain risk assessments in relation to the specific hazards that they're assigned responsibility for through the regulation. And local authorities will be responsible for preparing and maintaining a risk assessment for hazards that exist within their jurisdictions. And critical infrastructure owners will be responsible for preparing and maintaining a risk assessment with respect to the types of hazards that may affect the critical infrastructure. And public sector agencies will also be responsible for preparing and maintaining a risk assessment with respect to prescribed types of hazards. So for example, that means the types of hazards that are identified in a future public sector agency regulation. We're not quite there yet, but that's coming in the future. Okay. So that means in practice for all of these groups that there is going to be a need to identify all reasonably foreseeable hazards, assess the probability that an emergency will occur and the severity of it. And that assessment.
Kai, you're cutting out again.
Maybe I'll just, would it help if I just speak slower? I wonder if I'm just, it's having a hard time catching what I'm saying here.
It looks like you're using your mic and your laptop and it's not coming through. Great. You should have a headset.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is this any better at all?
Yeah, that's fine as long as you, keep still.
Okay. I will do my best to do that. Sorry for all these technical difficulties today. All right. Okay, so sorry, just carrying on from where I think I left off. Oops. Okay, so the assessment needs to include the potential consequences for people, property, and objects or sites of heritage value, with special focus given to individuals who may experience intersectional disadvantage and vulnerable people, animals, places, or things. The new act also provides the province the option to include additional requirements as to what must be assessed during risk assessment through regulation. All right, is audio still okay? Is that better?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, fantastic. I'll try to keep it slower then. So risk assessments in the proposed new legislation, we specify that they should be built on studies and surveys, Indigenous knowledge and local knowledge if it's available, and we have permission to use it. Changes in the local climate or extreme weather events that can reasonably be expected to result from a changing global climate, and the results from consultation with local authorities and Indigenous governing bodies. So again, the legislation provides flexibility to include additional sources of information through regulation. So the basis of risk assessments can evolve as new sources of information become available or as our needs change. So the existing Emergency Program Act does not include any consideration of the disproportionate impacts of disaster that's experienced by equity denied communities. And with a further nod to the Sendai framework and recognition of the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the proposed legislation is going to bring three new concepts into the forefront of practice, and that is consideration of disproportional impacts, cultural safety, and a requirement for consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples. And I'll cover that in the next few slides. So consideration of how different populations may experience disproportionate impacts from the same event is part of what brings the Sendai framework's all-of-society approach to life in the Act. The framework highlights that those who are historically marginalized or experience systemic oppression often also experience disproportionate adverse effects of disasters and diminished resilience and recovery due to those same systemic and societal constructs. The legislation is designed to help bridge that gap by requiring that risk assessments identify the groups that may be disproportionately impacted and the potential consequences those communities might be experiencing. So in following, emergency management plans will subsequently need to include measures to mitigate any adverse effects of an emergency on those groups of people. And that new requirement is going to apply to all regulated entities, which includes local authorities, ministries, critical infrastructure owners, and public sector agencies. So this is key to understanding disaster risk, as hazard risks and potential impacts will vary from community to community, and they will not necessarily be the same depending on each locale and context. So this makes sense if we consider that BC has a lot of diversity in our geography, the realities of our various populations and experience, and that applies across the province. So to give you a practical example, we might identify that extreme heat will disproportionately impact unhoused, elderly, and differently abled people, and that due to their experience of systemic inequality, they may not have the capacity to withstand such an emergency event on their own without support. And how that would play out in practice for us is that a risk assessment would identify this type of additional risk, and consequently an emergency management plan would then identify the measures needed to be taken to address the additional risk. So in this case, that might be opening a cooling center that's available 24/7 with added communication options, or transportation provided for the elderly or differently abled. And so, of course, the type of mitigative actions would be different depending on the realities of each community. Okay, so cultural safety is another equally important and related concept that is embedded in the modernized approach to emergency management. And this is an outcome that is going to be based on respectful engagement that is going to recognize and strive to address the power imbalances that are inherent in the disaster response system. And the goal is to create an environment that is free of racism and discrimination, where people can feel safe when receiving support across all phases of emergency management. And cultural safety really begins with respect and it ends with the relationships, as is often the case here. So if we start with cultural humility, that will progress towards cultural awareness, then to sensitivity, allowing us to have competency, and it will eventually enable us to create an environment of cultural safety. So EMCR staff, we're all working on developing new guidance and materials to support building a consistent understanding of cultural safety and how that can be integrated into EM practice in all phases. So we can look forward to more information on that in the future. Okay. So finally, this leads us to the new requirements for consultation and cooperation. So this is to align with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA, as you're going to commonly hear us refer to it as. And all regulated entities are required to consult and cooperate with Indigenous government bodies in the process of developing risk assessments and emergency management plans. Now, the results of those conversations can also help to close those gaps, such as disproportionate impacts, as well as cultural safety, and that's how they can also be addressed through those discussions. So consultation and cooperation during the development of risk assessments can include building an understanding of changes that elders have seen happening to local landscapes and how that is impacted on traditional food sources, and consultation and cooperation during the development of emergency management plans should include two things. So one is consulting and cooperating in relation to the content of the emergency management plan, so such as how communications will play out during emergencies, or what measures will be in place to ensure cultural safety. Now, local authorities will, and secondly, local authorities are also going to be required to make reasonable efforts to reach agreements with Indigenous governing bodies on the areas to be described in the local authority emergency management plans. And that's for the purposes of consultation and cooperation during the response and recovery phases. Now, while relevant areas and Indigenous governing bodies must be described in local authority emergency management plans, how agreement on those matters is resolved is not going to be prescribed, but best practices is generally to confirm the agreement in writing. So local authorities may also wish to begin those discussions before the legislation is introduced, as early identification of Indigenous governing bodies and agreement concerning areas for consultation and cooperation will position all decision makers, including Indigenous governing bodies, local authorities, and the province in a good position for collaborative and effective emergency management. Okay, so we know this is a lot, so local authorities are welcome to contact the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness with their questions or requests for assistance with this process. Okay. And whenever a local authority reaches agreement with an Indigenous governing body concerning areas for consultation and cooperation, the details of that agreement must be shared with the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, just so that we're aware. Okay. And there's also going to be a requirement for the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness to make reasonable efforts to also reach agreements with Indigenous governing bodies regarding areas for consultation and cooperation. However, if those agreements have already been reached between local authorities and Indigenous governing bodies, the parameters of those agreements will apply to consultation and cooperation required for the province, and no further agreements will be necessary. And that requirement for EMCR to seek those agreements will be phased in to avoid overlapping with the efforts to reach agreements at the local level. Okay, so this is a very brief and high-level introduction of what's in fact a really big major shift in the province's approach to emergency management. And this topic definitely deserves extra attention. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions. So please tune back in on August the 23rd, because we'll be doing a deep dive into that important area, and I'm pretty sure you're not going to miss it. Okay. All right, so in similar vein, regulated entities are also going to be required to consult and coordinate with local authorities while formulating their risk assessments and emergency management plans. So for local authorities, this means consulting with neighboring local authorities to ensure that emergency management plans can be coordinated, especially for critical areas like, say, for example, evacuation routes that people that may cross over or travel through those different jurisdictions. So that means that depending on the geographic location and who borders a specific area of jurisdiction, a local authority will have to consult and coordinate, as well as consult and cooperate with different neighbors. Okay? So just note that because there are fine differences in the requirements, the modernized emergency management legislation does distinguish between consultation and coordination requirements for Indigenous governing bodies, which includes Nisga'a Nation and Treaty First Nations, but it also differentiates with consultation and cooperation with local authorities. So thank you, and I'll hand it over to Tina Neal so she can give you an overview of the work that disaster risk management team is doing to support risk assessments, and then we'll circle back to emergency management plans later in the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Kai. So as you've heard, and as we're all becoming more aware, this approach to risk assessment is different. It is expanded and not typical. It's not your typical HRVA. So Kai has talked about a couple of the new requirements, and considering climate change is another one. So as we know, climate change is impacting the frequency, the intensity, the extent and impact and duration of weather-related hazards. We also know that we will have to respond to non-weather-driven hazards like earthquakes, for example, in a climate-changed world. So climate change is a significant new consideration that currently isn't typically built into our risk assessment processes. So my team in the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness has been established to help support the development of new methodologies and approaches to risk assessment, as well as create guidance and supports for regulated entities who will be implementing these requirements under the new emergency management legislation. So I will talk a little bit more about the methodology, but this slide talks about our approach to integrating climate change into risk assessments. We are really lucky in BC. We have an organization called the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. Their job is to take information from climate models that look at how the climate is going to change from now into the future, and to make that information relevant to BC. So we'll be partnering with them and using climate change scenarios to understand how climate risks could change between now and the end of the century. And because we don't have a crystal ball and we don't know exactly how much climate is going to change, because that's really dependent on how different countries reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to be looking at two different scenarios. One that is 2 degrees of global warming by 2100, and one that is a higher amount, 3.5 degrees by 2100. So climate change impacts can also be informed by local knowledge, as we just heard about. So that will also be an important part of the work. So let's go on to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about how risk assessment, how we're envisioning we will develop and evolve our risk assessment methodology. There we go, thank you. So the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy actually have a joint mandate letter commitment to conduct a disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment for the province. So this requirement was put in our minister's mandate letters, I think with the knowledge that these new requirements were coming out under EDMA, and that we would need to take leadership as the province in understanding how to evolve our risk assessment processes. So my team and I are working with ministries across government who have responsibility for assessing hazards under the new legislation. And we are working together to help to develop this methodology, excuse me, and we will be testing it out in a first phase of work using 6 different hazards, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So what we are aiming for is to create a consistent framework for risk assessment that meets the requirements of the new legislation, including upholding local and Indigenous knowledges, embedding equity and climate science into the process. We are also, I saw one of the comments in Slido about how this could potentially be a very siloed process with all of these different ministries and local authorities and public sector organizations all doing risk assessments. So we are proposing a process to coordinate those risk assessments and ensure that any engagement that needs to be done is done in a coordinated way. So a single engagement process for the hazards to ensure that we avoid engagement fatigue. And then the lessons and that we learn out of this process, this kind of development and testing of this new framework will constitute the guidance and materials that we produce to support regulated entities under the legislation. Let's move on to the next slide. So we're working on a time frame of mid-2024 to release our first phase of work. So that will be a provincial scale risk and resilience assessment for a select number of hazards, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And then we have a future phase of work planned, which will be a series of regional risk assessments that we will conduct over the following 2 years. So to release results in 2026. And we would, our plan for those would be to support the work that local authorities will need to do and critical infrastructure operators by coordinating risk assessment activity and conducting assessments at a regional scale that can then inform the risk assessments for local authorities and others. So we're currently in this first phase of work. We're establishing a contract with an external consultant to coordinate and help support the technical aspects of the work. And we are in initial conversations to co-develop the methodology with First Nations and Treaty Nations, and also engaging with Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners. Next slide. So the key questions that the assessment will help to answer is things like, what are the current and future levels of risk and resilience? What are the key drivers of risks? How do risks and resilience vary across BC, including across geographies, different populations, rural and urban communities? What risks, mitigation measures, vulnerabilities, and resilience traits are specific to distinct and unique First Nations and Indigenous persons and communities? And to what extent are the risks being managed? If we're going to use the results of this type of assessment to understand what actions we should take, we should understand what actions we're already taking to manage risks and how we are, as different populations and different organizations, currently resilient to these to the risks. And then what are the priority actions that we need to take in the next 5 to 10 years to reduce risk and build resilience in BC? One of the other components of our minister's mandate letter is that this risk and resilience assessment will inform a future disaster and climate risk reduction plan. So let's go to the next slide. One of the major shifts that we are bringing into our new approach is a values-based approach. Typically, risk assessments like HRVAs have been kind of desktop exercises or exercises involving a small number of experts, particular people who conduct the assessment and really take a fairly technical approach to it. What we understand we need to do, given the focus, the need to involve equity denied populations, the need to look at the ways that hazards differentially affect different populations, is that we need to really shift to a values-based approach to understand, start by defining what are the things that we value, what are these value groups, and then looking at what do those values mean in terms of risk and resilience. So we'll be operationalizing that by developing resilience statements, which means what does resilience look like in the context of disaster and climate events for each of the value areas, and then risk statements, which is really answering the question, how will value areas be affected by disaster and climate hazards? And you can imagine that if you ask those questions to different populations, you will get different answers. So part of the process of doing a risk assessment needs to be engagement and working together with different groups of people who have different identity traits and experience the hazards in different ways, so that we can really have more of a comprehensive understanding of how the consequences of different hazards will play out in our province. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Excuse me. So we've been working with a group of consultants to develop a draft framework for the assessment. And this really maps out the different kinds of activities that we'll be carrying out over the next year to conduct the assessment. So we've currently been working on the co-development approach and prioritizing the risks through some early engagement and co-development, research, looking at looking at current events, looking at what different reports and recommendations to government have advised, et cetera. And so our next phase of work is going to be related to information gathering, research, and the quantitative analysis. And then this fall, we will be getting into the participatory assessment and consequences. So that's where we will be exploring those value groups, the risk and resilience statements, and really engaging very broadly and co-developing the actual assessment results. So let's go on to the next slide. So through our early work and through our own internal decision-making process within government, these are the risks that we will be assessing in this first phase of work. So we'll note that this does not cover the broad range of risks that will be assigned, for example, in the ministry's regulation, or that the Emergency and Disaster Management Act will address. But this gives us an opportunity to look at some high priority risks and explore how the methodology that we're developing will work. We are also, in addition to looking at the two different kinds of flooding, wildfire, water scarcity, extreme heat, and earthquake, we're also looking to develop a scenario of a cascading or compounding event. I think it's very clear from our experience in the last few years that climate-related and non-climate related risks don't happen in isolation. They actually interact with each other. So we're looking to explore through the assessment how those consequences of multiple co-occurring events will play out. So moving on to the next slide. As I've mentioned a few times, we are in the process of co-developing. So my ministry, Emergency Management Climate Readiness, and the Climate Action Secretariat, who are our partners in Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy, are taking a distinctions-based approach to the co-development of this disaster and climate risk and resilience assessment. The idea here is to meet or exceed alignment with the Declaration Act and objectives relating to risk assessments and upholding Indigenous knowledges in the First Nations Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan. So noting that in that action plan, there was a call for risk assessments that are led by the province to be co-developed with First Nations and Treaty First Nations. The co-development activities to date have focused on the hazard selection and that framework, that initial framework. And as we move farther into the process, we will focus more on the actual analysis. Next slide. The outputs from this exercise are going to be hosted on the new Climate Ready BC platform. The Climate Ready BC platform is our kind of one-stop shop for disaster and climate risk reduction information, maps, data, guidance to support nations, local governments, public and private sector, and anyone else who is interested in taking action to reduce climate and disaster risk. So you can go check out the website at climatereadybc.gov.bc.ca. And if you have feedback on it, we would love to hear from you at climatereadybc@gov.bc.ca. So all of the products that we generate through the risk assessment process, as well as the guidance, will be put onto the platform. And we will continue to build this platform out over time to support disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation activities. Next slide. So our next steps, we've sent out a save the date to First Nations, and we are also in the process of planning virtual and in-person sessions for this fall and winter. We are going to stand up some technical working groups here very shortly to start working specifically on the different hazards. So as I said, we anticipate releasing the assessment in June 2024, and that will inform a subsequent province-wide disaster and climate risk reduction plan. And then we would kick off regional assessments after the release of the provincial assessment to get into more granular detail at the regional scale and to assess priority risks for different regions in the province. Okay, and I think that's it for me. Happy to pass it on to Anna.
Thank you so much, Tina, and good morning, everyone. So we are now moving on from risk assessments to new legislative requirements specific to emergency management planning. So first, we'll cover who is responsible for preparing and maintaining emergency management plans. Again, as with the risk assessments, the legislation captures regulated entities here. So this includes lead ministers who are designated responsibility for specific hazards, local authorities, critical infrastructure owners, and public sector agencies. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So the requirement for regulated entities to complete their emergency management plans is set out in the new legislation, and the requirements for each class of regulated entities will be phased in through regulations. So emergency management plans for regulated entities must address all 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. And for each phase, the plans must describe appropriate measures that may be taken. Emergency management plans must also include descriptions of the roles, powers, and duties of key persons, as well as requirements for emergency resources, procedures for engaging emergency systems, and plans for training and exercise programs. Emergency management plans must reflect measures to mitigate the effects of emergencies on people, animals, places, and things that are vulnerable, and on people who may be disproportionately impacted by emergencies. The plans will also have to include measures to promote cultural safety, and they must be based on completed risk assessments and on the results of actions taken to consult with local authorities and indigenous governing bodies. So in addition to these requirements, as Kyle already mentioned, local authorities will need to work with indigenous governing bodies to determine areas for the purposes of consultation and cooperation during the response and recovery phases. And this means determining which indigenous governing bodies should be consulted and cooperated with in specific geographic areas. These areas must also be outlined in local authority emergency management plans once agreed upon. And as Kai had also mentioned, you'll hear more about this during the future presentation on consultation and cooperation. Local authorities must also include a plan for the evacuation and care of individuals and animals in the area within the jurisdiction of the local authority. And we'll go to the next slide. So the comprehensive emergency management plan is the emergency management plan for the provincial government, and it includes the emergency management plans provided by each lead minister assigned responsibility for a specific hazard. And so this plan applies across the province of British Columbia. Under the modernized legislation, the provincial administrator, which is an official within EMCR, is responsible for the comprehensive emergency management plan. And this includes preparing, reviewing, revising, and implementing the plan. The provincial administrator must also consult with local authorities and indigenous governing bodies during the development or review of the comprehensive emergency management plan. Also within another emergency management plan that must be prepared by the provincial administrator, the provincial administrator must provide information regarding each area in relation to which the provincial administrator or a local authority has reached an agreement with indigenous governing bodies regarding consultation and cooperation during the response or recovery phases. So EMCR is currently working on developing a policy guidance document to assist ministries in developing their hazard-specific plans. And EMCR also anticipates updating the BC Emergency Management System Manual in 2024. And we'll go to the next slide, please. New legislation also includes the requirement for all government ministries, whether they are lead ministers for hazards or non-lead ministers, as well as local authorities, critical infrastructure owners, and public sector agencies to prepare and maintain a business continuity plan. Similar to emergency management planning requirements, business continuity planning requirements will be phased in over time. Some regulated entities, for example, all government ministries already have business continuity plans in place. There will also be a requirement for the Legislative Assembly, Executive Council, which is basically the cabinet, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, which is the government house, and courts to prepare and maintain what are referred to in the legislation as government continuity plans. And they are essentially business continuity plans for those entities. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So the purpose of a business or a government continuity plan is to describe ways of ensuring continued delivery of services during an emergency. Detailed guidance for government ministries on completing business continuity plans is provided in the Core Policy and Procedures Manual in Chapter 16, which is called Business Continuity Management. And this manual is published on the BC government website. While the guidance in the manual is specific to government ministries, some components may be relevant to business continuity plans by other regulated entities. So business continuity is essentially a professional methodology that safeguards key service delivery by creating and maintaining business continuity plans and programs. Business continuity plans contain the recovery procedures and strategies necessary to resume key services. While emergency management focuses on the event containment and response, business continuity focuses more on the resumption of key services until a return to normal business operations is possible. So business continuity planning allows an organization to protect the availability of key services despite very challenging circumstances. While the legislation does not provide details on what must be included in a business continuity plan, it's very high level. Industry standards often reflect the following pieces. Conducting a business impact analysis to identify scope and scale of plan. Business continuity plans must consider risk assessments. They must they must provide an outline of key services, recovery strategies and procedures, as well as resources and staffing needed to maintain key services. Other components may include regular training and exercising of the plan to ensure it works as intended, awareness and ongoing plan refinement to address gaps and changing requirements. EMCR has a business continuity management program team that continues to work with BC government organizations to support their business continuity planning requirements. And we're also working to identify necessary guidance materials required to support the completion of business continuity plans by other regulated entities. And we would welcome any suggestions in that area. Next slide, please. So under the Modernized Emergency Management legislation, the minister has new powers to order a regulated entity to take specific mitigation or preparation measures. So essentially, the minister will be able to make an order if they are satisfied that based on one or more risk assessments, the order is necessary to mitigate or prepare for a specific type of hazard that presents a significant risk of becoming an emergency. The minister may also make an order that says that a regulated entity must support a specific initiative in relation to the mitigation and preparation phases. Some of the examples of what the minister may require in an order are to provide to the provincial administrator information respecting specific infrastructure, facilities, and equipment, to support or participate in specific emergency management training or exercise programs, including emergency planning sessions or programs relating to cultural safety, or related to considering impacts on persons who may be disproportionately impacted by emergencies. Another example where a lead minister may require in an order is to take specific emergency measures for the purposes of the mitigation or preparation phases, and to obtain or upgrade infrastructure, facilities, equipment, and some of their components, whether they are physical or virtual. So with respect to taking specific emergency measures for the purposes of the mitigation or preparation phases, and to obtain or upgrade, for example, infrastructure, there is an obligation for the minister in the new legislation to consult and cooperate with indigenous governing bodies before making those types of orders. Next slide, please. So we're taking a phased approach to implementation of the legislation and regulations. And what it means is that once the legislation receives a royal assent, it will be available on the BC Law's website for everyone to access. However, not all of the requirements in the legislation will be coming into force right away. Some aspects will be ready for implementation immediately, and other aspects will be implemented later, including the requirements for risk assessments and emergency management planning by local authorities, critical infrastructure owners, and public sector agencies. EMCR is also working on developing or updating guiding policy documents for the new requirements, as well as ensuring that existing policies are updated to align with the modernized legislation and also provide greater clarity on the processes. Next slide, please. So a series of regulations will bring into force the requirements for risk assessment and emergency management planning, recognizing that implementation of the modernized emergency management legislation will require a multi-year phased approach. Regulations will also be developed and implemented over time. Until the new requirements in the regulations come into force, transitional rules in the legislation will help to clarify equivalences in existing emergency management planning activities. So on this slide, you can see our targeted timelines for the regulations for each class of regulated entities. And I'll note that we're just beginning our work on regulations. So these timelines are tentative and may change. We will also be engaging relevant partners for each of those regulations as we work through them, and we'll be also co-developing the regulations with First Nations partners. And next slide, please. So over the summer, we are working to ensure that there is common understanding of the legislation. As promised, we've posted a link to the technical paper that we recently released, and I encourage all of you to download a copy of it. So as I already mentioned, the ministry is working on other guidance materials, templates, and similar supports that can be released in the coming months to support the implementation of the proposed legislation. This webinar is a part of series, so please tune into the next session we'll be offering on August 9th, where we'll speak more on agreements and collaboration. Additional guidance is also in progress, and discussion documents with additional detail on the forthcoming local authorities regulation and post-emergency financial assistance regulation are planned for release in September 2023. EMCR will also be providing a workshop at the Union of British Columbia Municipalities Convention on regulatory concepts related to local authorities and the financial assistance regulation. And let's go to the next slide, please. So this brings us to the end of our session. And thank you so much for your participation today. I noticed that we got only 1 minute left. So I will pass it back to...
I've got it, Anna. It's
yeah,
all good.
thank you so much.
All good. So thank you very much for the presentation, all of you. It was very informative. There are lots and lots of questions on Slido. So because we've run out of time, there isn't time to ask questions out loud, but I strongly encourage people to visit that Slido link. It'll be open for the next few days. Populate your questions in there, vote on other questions. It is our intent to take all of those questions back to EMCR and get responses for those questions. So surely, unfortunately, there wasn't time to ask them verbally, but we definitely want to make sure we're gathering that feedback and answering those questions. And as Anna mentioned, there are future sessions coming up. So August 9th is the next one. Hope to see you all there. You can register online. And then also please do check out the BCAEM website. That's where we're going to be posting the PowerPoints for this. And if you're a member, you're also available to download the recording once those are available. Questions can be also issued to outreach@bcaem.ca, or they can be sent directly to EMCR. So check out the chat there. There's a few emails in there and a few links in there. I'll just leave it open as people duck out to gather that information. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and thank you to EMCR for providing a presentation.